Hi again, and welcome back to Platonic Soul. Hope you've been well. As you may have heard me say before, it often seems like oneness is the holy grail of our time. It's the great quest of us in the secular West. And I think we also in the West tend to see science as our knight in shining armor. It's sort of the default solution to our problems for us often. And so these are connected because in my last episode, I talked about how it seems almost as though as scientists continue to learn more about the brain, they seem to be discovering not only that these unitive states, when we seem profoundly to be at one with both ourselves and the world, the universe, that they're good for us. They're also discovering more and more ways to attain them through the adoption and or adaptation of Eastern practices like of mindfulness and also through psychedelic drugs. And so it can often feel a bit almost heretical to say something like this, but I don't believe science will ever succeed in satisfying our craving for oneness. Not fully. I don't think it's something science can actually do, at least on its own. It's just not in its nature. And in this episode, I'd like to explain why I think this way. One thing I think my series has been getting at so far is that the essence of these states lies in the transcendence of the subject-object relationship. When we describe these states as unitive, what we mean is that they seem to involve an immediate perception of reality. They're a kind of cognition that doesn't involve abstraction as a medium that comes in between the self and reality. So they're unitive because in these moments, we aren't aware of being a subject in relation to an object as we are when we're thinking in the ordinary, everyday, abstractive kind of way that neurologists would associate with the default mode network. And when you think about it, of course, this is really the only conceivable way one could overcome this existential alienation that we're prone to as humans, because the cause of it seems to be abstraction. That's why these unitive or mystical, if you like, experiences tend to be essentially ineffable. They're not communicable, at least in ordinary language. They don't involve the abstractions that language uses. So it doesn't seem possible for us to communicate them using language and its abstractions. And as we saw a few episodes ago, this was the reason Freud gave, actually, for not being able to. He felt he couldn't talk about these states scientifically. I can't talk about feelings, he wrote, because for him, the purely subjective nature of feeling makes it ungraspable with the abstractions of objective universal science. And yet it's common for people who have had these experiences, as we saw with Proust and Ava, the Inuit shaman, to nevertheless be able to come away with something speakable. Of course, this is really the case with feelings in general, isn't it? I mean, in a way, we can't speak them. We feel we'll never be able to do them justice. We'll never be able to fully capture them. And yet we do our best because we really sort of have to live with other people. And what that speakable thing tends to be for people who've had these unitive experiences is a sense that in some mysterious way, what they've perceived is somehow truer and better than the world that they perceive in everyday cognition with its abstractive structure. For them, what they saw or experienced when they seemed to be joined with reality in this way was both truer and better than what they seemed to perceive during moments of alienation from it. One thing we saw last time is a possible scientific explanation of how these experiences can, in a sense, at least in a certain sense, be truer than the everyday. The idea was that the over-constrained cognition that we experience in our daily routines and self-reflection is suspended, and there's a return to a sort of radical open-mindedness. There have also been attempts to explain why the sense of unity experienced in these states seems to carry on to some extent into the lives of people thereafter. So, for example, we saw that for the Inuit Ava, this experience, ecstatic experience, sort of set him on course to be a shaman. And for Proust, or for Marcel, the character in Proust's novel, ostensibly fictitious novel, ostensible novel, um, his ecstasy set him on course to be a writer. So in both of these, there's a sense of unity being preserved after the experience in the form of a sense of purpose. And we also saw that Maslow liked to use this term plateau experience to explain how the effect of the peak experience continued. And in neurology, we have the concept of neuroplasticity, this idea that the brain rewires itself. That says that in these experiences, neurons are making presumably new connections that outlast the experience itself. But here's the thing, when it comes to the world and the self as perceived in these states, being in some deep, mysterious way better than they seem in the everyday, this is really a realm about which science can say nothing, because value is outside the scope of science. Science has to deal in the objective, the universally testable. But of course, values of good and bad differ from person to person. So although science can say something is good or bad relative to something else, like smoking is bad for your health, it just ceases to be science anymore when it starts to make statements about absolute value. Like, you don't see a lot of scientific papers arguing that smoking is evil, for example. So at first, this might not really seem that important. I mean, you could say this doesn't change the fact that science is finding these increasing ways to bring these unitive states about in us. But actually, I think the fact that it can't speak to the deep goodness people in these states seem to see is really critical, because as long as this is a question mark in us, we'll never really be able to incorporate the benefits of these experiences into our daily lives, because this question mark will continue to erode the very sense of unity we've been seeking. This is because questions of good and evil are really of fundamental importance to us, even in our everyday lives, I think. And even though we're not always aware of this. As you might have heard me mention in an earlier episode, they're really hardwired into our daily lives, in our emotions, which I think always involves some form of judgment of good and evil, even if this judgment is not really conscious. For example, it happens so quickly that we don't really remember making it. I think that's to some extent what we mean by an unconscious judgment. We might be annoyed by someone sort of making a noise that interrupts our thought, and before we're really even aware of it, we're thinking, that rapscallion. So we almost instinctively put us above that which we find annoying, the source of what we find annoying in some absolute way. But it's almost so quick that we're not really aware of it. And I think this is really sort of that godlike power of judgment of good and evil that Genesis is talking about, that Adam and Eve get. That it's a godlike power, but it also puts them out. It's the same abstractive power that puts them out of the garden. Anyway, so this was sort of implied also several episodes ago, in that reading I did of Eckhart Tolle, where good and evil seem to be intimately caught up in questions of existential hope and despair. He related this episode from his life of existential despair, when he felt that reality was flawed, not just flawed in a morally neutral sense, but to him the outside world actually seemed malevolent, and his own self seemed loathsome to him. And so as long as we're not able to explain to ourselves why these experiences, these ecstatic experiences, seem to show us a world that's not just truer, but better, there's always going to be an important question in us that gets ignored. It's an important question. It's an important desire in us. It's an important part of us that gets ignored. And to ignore an impulse is really to repress it. I mean, Freud was fond of using this term, of using this, it's really a metaphor or analogy of something pressing on something else to describe the world of consciousness, which of course doesn't, at least subjectively, work in that physical way. But what repression really is just ignoring something in our consciousness. And as we also see in Freud, repression increases dividedness in the self. And so I think there's this, along with this sort of faith we have in science, comes this sort of subtle but deep-set skepticism about our ability or the desirability of answering questions like these. And I think it's sadder than we're really aware of. It's a subtle but critical repressive force, I think, really. And I think it leads to an equally subtle but deep hopelessness that we're often not really consciously aware of. A hopelessness that this desire will ever be satisfied, or even that we in a way deserve to have it satisfied. There's almost this sense to us in our technological world that it's the way we turn to science as a default answer to everything, sort of, to me, suggests that there's almost a sense that asking questions about the goodness of things or of reality as a whole is sort of outside of our pay grade, almost. And so the part of the self that naturally craves an answer for this is sort of just assumed to go unanswered, ignored, and in a way not deserving of an answer. But anyway, science isn't, of course, the only resource we humans have or have had for, trying to make life better. When it comes to trying to incorporate oneness into our lives, there's been one practice in particular that humans have used across cultures and times. And in the next episode, I'd like to talk a bit about it. I think it's always had great power. It's brought benefit to people. It's also been cruel at times, and dangers have come with it. And I think these dangers continue to menace us today, actually, without our being aware of it in somewhat different forms. And I'd like to be talking about all these things in upcoming episodes. So anyway, thanks again for watching, and hope to see you next time. Bye.